This is my nightmare moment. Laura, I think I've been set up to crash here. I've got no pictures, it's just words. And then before that, Matt, all pictures. It's actually 42 years, and I was chuckling when you were talking about mobile phones, because I actually lived in the era, I started work in 1977, when there was no mobile phones, no laptops to speak of, and they emerged in their first state in the early 80s, I think. I was working in retail at the time, and we all got very excited. The price of a mobile phone in those days was about £3,500. I guess in today's money about 12 grand. You didn't just get a phone that was the size of a brick with a big rubber aerial on it. You got a 2-kilogram battery pack with a curly wire that went up to it, and we all walked around the street trying to get signals to talk to each other. And it had nothing to do with work or communication. And the thing I remember in that, it came rushing back to me, is we had a sales director who was very elusive. He was a smart guy, and you were never able to trace where he was, but he spent all of his time going around stores on a Thursday and a Friday. And we all knew in our hearts that he always ended up in the Oxford store around lunchtime on a Friday, because that was 10 minutes away from where he lived. And when the mobile phone came in, wind the clock forward a year or two more when the network was working properly, he was rumbled because people could trace where he was and ring him up. Anyhow, there you go. So you're right, it's always on. Let me just do this. It's actually 42 years in HR. I worked out when I was sitting there, I can't add up. I think it's fair to say that the journey I've been on crosses several bridges between a world when I started as a postgraduate trainee in a company called British Leyland that many of you won't even have heard of, but it was a nationalised company. All of the automotive industry and all of anything that had wheels run with 300,000 people, making tanks for military purposes, Commentary Climax forklift trucks, all of the car brands that were British made, Rover and all the rest of it, Land Rover and the lot. And I was actually working in the division of British Leyland that was called Leyland Special Products, which was really, if we don't know where to put it, we'll put it in special products. And my bit was refrigeration, so think of that. And you were talking about basketball, Matt, and changing the move on the foot, pivoting. The refrigeration company that I worked in was born out of excess car plant. I think it was the Marina, I think that was the name of the car. One of you might have seen that in a museum by now. They had a company called Press Steel Fisher that made car bodies. They had too many factories, so they decided to press out fridges instead, so change the shape from a car to a box. That then led into industrial refrigeration, and before you know it, we were doing mortuaries and God knows what. And it became the biggest refrigeration company in the world. I digress, it was sold, of course, because it didn't have wheels. But in those days, the whole culture, to me, when I look back at it, was all about do what you're told. It was boss subordinate from top to bottom. So you did what your boss told you to do. You didn't push back. You were very rarely asked. Procedures and processes dominated a nationalised company, and probably to a point dominated all the other companies that were around about. And I remember also thinking that one day when I was put into a compensation and benefits job at the age of whatever I was, 24, my first reward job in modern language, I decided I needed a calculator, not the ones we have on our phones, but the one with a windy bit and a roll comes off the end. I filled out a form. It was submitted up through the chain of command to be authorised, and by the time it arrived on my desk, I'd changed jobs. It took that long. So the world has changed a lot. I've worked in some of the best companies, and I think I've put right up there, PepsiCo back in the 90s, 80s and 90s was an incredible company. We doubled in size. I wasn't there for 15 years, but doubled every 5 years for 3 years in a row. And in the meantime spun off a restaurant business as well. And I've worked in some of the worst companies as well, and I'm going to take a little bit of a risk because everyone seems to be effing and blinding here. I'll try not to use the F word. But I'm going to talk about this company briefly because I joined it and was subsequently part of the process when it was sold to Pernod Ricard. The company's name was Allied Domecq. If you think pubs, wine, spirits, restaurants, and 70,000 people around the world, that would be it. I was their first ever, in modern language, Chief Human Resources Officer. They always put somebody who was about to retire from running a distillery in the group HR job before that, and they decided they would go professional, and I was the first guy out of PepsiCo. And I'm sitting there being inducted by the company secretary. Think about that. No induction program. Company secretary comes in with a lever arch file. He opens it up, and as he's taking me through all of the things I'm meant to be responsible for, he gets to my budget. And I'm running my arm down this budget, and sitting in one of the columns was a number, £7 million. I remember that. I said, what's that? And it was called, in Allied Domec, everything had an AD prefix. So it was called the advance budget. I said, what's advance? He said, let me see. Oh yes, he said, one of the guys in marketing came to the board of directors, and we had directors meetings probably for a week, a month, by the time we'd done it. And he presented a proposal to change the culture. And the minute says, and the board agreed that he should change the culture. And that's your 7 million. So I shut that down straight away. It's extraordinary. So that's one of the worst companies I've seen. What I'm really going to do here is say, what have I learnt in 42 years? And the answer is probably not very much about companies, because it's bleeding obvious when you look at where the good ones are and where the bad ones are. And if you're looking at engagement, which is why we're all here, and happiness in particular, what a surprise. A unified, gifted leadership group. And my line goes back to the Allied Domec days. We had the opposite. We had a crock of shit at the top of the business. And I had a weird job because the chairman, a guy called Christopher Hogg, who was a very good thinking, leading kind of guy, he was actually married and still is to Miriam Stoppard. I used to get to the office quite early, and Miriam Stoppard was the agony aunt on the Daily Mirror or Mail, and we'd sit there, he'd said, I spent last night, look at this letter, and he'd read all the letters about people who had sexual problems and relationship problems as well, and he'd help her write the answers, which is, if you met him, you'd be surprised. He was a very dry old guy. But if you don't have a great leadership group, forget it, because whatever you try to do in terms of engaging, winning hearts and minds, getting people to do things in a way that makes them happy, just doesn't work. And within that, a group that values authenticity and individuality, so that it goes back to when I started work. You can't just do what you're told to do. You've got to be able to feel like you're contributing, feel like there's a different way if you want to do it a different way, and feel like you're part of something that is good and engaging. These people also willingly accept responsibility for developing the next generation. I'm going to come back to that later, but that doesn't necessarily mean creating an academy. We're in one. Running off-site programs for people to learn how to be better leaders. It's about the doing of helping people to develop, not the sending them on a program. And I think within that, this is a thing, there's a Pepsi tale coming later, import and export people from your group. The tendency for a good leader who has good people around his or her table is to try and hold on to those good people. Because why would you export them and take a risk of bringing someone in that you don't know about? So it's kind of counterintuitive. Great companies actually accept responsibility for moving people around, and the leadership group in the end buys into that. But if they haven't bought into it, it's awkward. Two other things, got to keep an eye on the clock. Strong environment and culture. Well, again, that's what today's about. If you don't have a clear understanding of what you're trying to be and what you're trying to do, then you're not going to get anywhere with the people that you have working in there. And don't be shy, a clear focus on being a successful company. What does it take to be successful? Bottom line, high levels of trust. I'm going to cover all these things as I go through this. If there's no trust, it goes back to the leadership thing, nothing's going to happen. If you don't feel like, when you turn up at work, that the place you're working in is built on a platform of trust where people can express their points of view and people can challenge and people can do things in a constructive way but challenge the status quo, then you're not going to get very far. And I underline communications. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a minute, but effective communications as distinct from chucking out emails with the 5-year plan to people who are paid 16 grand a year in a call centre. You know, we've had people in Gateshead, in WorldPay was my last company, where you know, a 45-page, all hands, 900 people email from the director of strategy saying, here's our 5-year plan. What do you think they said when I went up there to have a feedback session? This one, I've come out of touch with all the big polls, but back in my day, go back to Allied Domec as my first big engagement survey, the big houses like Gallup called all the shots on engagement. And I remember the bill in 1997 or 8 for paying, it was actually Hay who did the survey for us in Allied Domecq, 70,000 people in 40 countries around the world. The bill was £250,000. I remember that one because I sat there shocked at how much this cost. The debrief, in the days when everything was done on pencil and paper, side story, the Mexicans got 100% satisfaction level because their managing director of the 2 factories that we had put them all in a room and stood and told them the answers, and they all marked with their pencils. So interesting time. But £250,000, when Hay turned up to tell us what the results were, 6 people walked into the room with 2 lever arch files, about 300 pages deep under each arm, and put them on the table and kind of handed them over. So there was no question of knowing what, data we had, and there was no way that we could dive deep into the data we had. But those guys ruled the world. Everybody did once a year, big event, 3 months of hard graft, and no outcome from a survey, compared to today, where you can do it for a fraction of the price, online, happiness index, etc. But consistently across all those years, I must confess that I've stopped tracking this in the last 10, so it might be slightly wrong. The thing that always came out to me, about 70% of people leave their boss, not their company. So when people quit, they're not quitting because they think they're working in a shit place. They're quitting because the person they're working for is probably a shit leader or a shit person. And it doesn't change. So, there, I've got some swear words. It's better. I'm going to do a quick Bruce Forsyth thing. It goes back to what I said at the start. Private and working personas are basically, in good companies, merging into one. You don't get dressed differently to go to work, to behave in a different way, and then go home in the evening and change into something else and become someone else. That's what authenticity is all about. And in good companies, authentic leaders demonstrate that. They know and show themselves as individuals. I know this is a bit pants because we all know that, but it's the people who you think would be the same if you went and socialised with them as they are in the workplace. They take personal risks. I certainly do and did. They conform enough to fit in, but they're still themselves. Greatest development occurs when 2 things happen. This was a PepsiCo experience. That's where we really nailed it when we were rolling along and growing fast. You only need 2 things for development: a great boss and a really stretching assignment. Have I got time to tell another little anecdote? 5.
Yeah.
Ah, sorry. I'm usually plugged into one of these things. I moved from British Leyland to Levi Strauss. Imagine bureaucratic, nationalised industry to a new company that had just arrived in Europe, where the demand for denim was insatiable, and all the denim companies in the States couldn't make enough jeans. So we had a sales organisation that used to go to companies like Debenhams and Burton Group, etc. And our sales guys who drove BMWs and were aged 22, 23 used to sit down with a buyer, and the buyer would plead for 10,000 units of 501s, and the salesperson would laugh and say, "I'll give you 5 in 6 months if you take 20,000 of these things that you don't really need." And they say, yeah, we'll take it. That's what that was selling in those days. But I arrived, and I was hired as the manager of reward in modern money, reward manager for Northern Europe, which, as the Yanks used to say, large hat, not much cattle underneath, because it was really the UK and 4 Scandinavian countries that have about 50 people in there. And my boss, who is in his 70s now and remains a great friend, Keith Cameron, on my first day, I walked into the office and he slipped a Clark's shoebox across the table to me. And I said, "Oh, what's that?" And I was 27. And he lifted the lid and he said, "It's the pension scheme." I said, "What?" And inside it were about 3,000 little cardboard white note-lid things. And it had name, date joined company, date of birth, address written on each one. He said, "We've had a pension scheme for 4 years, and the unions up in the manufacturing plants in Scotland, 3,000 people up there making stuff, are a bit pissed off because we haven't produced a benefit statement yet." Understandable. I knew nothing about pensions. No computer to go to, by the way. You can't go and Google this stuff. So I said, "Right." He said, "So I want you to go away and solve the problem." That was my instruction. We had the yellow pages in the office. We didn't have Google, so I got the yellow pages. I found pensions in the back, found a company in Bristol, rang them up and said, "Here's my problem." The bloke said, "I'll come and meet you." He turned up. he said to me, "You need a computer." Now, these are the days when it was a big box on the floor and a screen, and it cost several £1,000s. I said, "Why?" He said, "Because we need to put all the records in the computer, we need to get your actuaries, blah, 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 blah. That's how we produce benefit statements, and we need a record system." So I went back to my boss a week later, Keith, and I said, "I need a computer." "Good, buy one." Think of the calculator. I said, "What do you mean buy one?" I said, "Is there a form I have to fill out?" And he said, "No, just order one." I said, "Well, who's going to pay for it?" He said, "We will, they'll send us a bill." "Oh, right, okay, I'll do that." So the computer arrives, the guy loads it up with all the data, wind the clock forward a few months, and we press the button, and out spews all this nice stuff. And what we'd also done is try and make it so that people understood what it actually meant. The handbook for the pension scheme, which was the other beef of the convener and the trade union, was written by an actuary. I didn't understand it. So we had a new diagram, sexy stuff, sticks of boxes, people, and all that stuff. And I learnt about pensions doing that. My point there is stretching assignment. It took me 6 months. I ended up flying up to Scotland, bricking it. I was going into a place where, of the 3,000 employees, 80% of them were female, middle-aged and above. Of those 80% were the sole breadwinners in their families. And they were tough, hard-ass, in the main Glaswegians. And here's this fresh-faced kid turning up. They could have been my mother. And I go to the union meeting on my own with a box in a bag. I put the box on the table, and I open the box, and I start to give my spiel, no PowerPoint, and I say to the woman, the convener, "Inside this box are the benefit statements." And she kissed me. She actually got up, walked around the table, and she kissed me. And I went bright red, I remember that. And she said, "Finally, some fuckers solved the problem." And I went back down to London, and I said to Keith, "We cracked it." He said, "Good, I knew you would." And that's, stretching assignment. Building badge. I'm going to skip through to this here. PepsiCo story. We had a company doubling in size every 5 years. We were hiring the best of, the greatest of the best internationally around the world, from all the best schools, all the best companies. It was a crazy time. In Europe, where I was the VP of HR, the president of Europe, who was a staffer, said, "What we need to do is we need to start doing this idea that I mentioned earlier of import-export. So we're going to have regional presidents, HRDs, at quarterly review meetings for 2 days. We've got 150 people that are categorized in the leadership group for Europe, and we're going to get this thing rolling." That was the first phrase that came out after the first failed meeting. Don't bury your dead in other people's gardens. Because what happened was, the unscrupulous amongst the presidents in particular thought, well, that guy is not that good at this, but he's not bad at that, so I'll try and move him. And it took us 2 years to get the whole thing running. And I'm speeding up a bit. So 2 years, the point to make is, it's not easy. If you're really committed as a leadership group to moving people around and developing them, it's not easy, and you need to have real commitment on that. Culture. Go back to the modern day. I talk about tight loose. Values and standards, how we work and how we behave, and this is what we expect from each other, that's non-negotiable. Loose, how you fit in within that, what you wear, how you work, where you work from, that's entirely up to you. I talked about the controlling environment. Phil Jansen, who's now the CEO of BT, I've known him for more than 20 years. He was joined on the same day as me at what is now Virgin Media as the Chief Marketing Officer, and I was the Chief Human Resources Officer. He got me out of retirement. I retired 3 times so far, to go into WorldPay when he was taking WorldPay from RBS and floating it. And he had a very simple approach. He wasn't interested in where people did their job. He said, all I'm interested in is output. If you're doing what you've agreed to do, or you've been asked to do it where you like. Stay at home if you want to. You don't have to come and sit here and do it in front of someone. So his whole idea is, let's look at output. And to make a point, at the Walbrook head office we had 800 people based there and seats for 450. Think about that. You had to scramble to get a desk in an open plan space, but the idea was, don't come in unless you have to. Pretty novel at the time. Individual differences of strength, flexible working improves performance, enable parents, that was a big thing we did there. It was a huge risk. I think WorldPay in the UK probably has, I've never really looked at the stats, but probably one of the most, we introduced one of the most extravagant maternity policies in the country. People could go off on maternity leave and take 6 months full pay and then 6 months half pay and come back. And it cost us hundreds of thousands of quid in the first year or two, but what we also got was a whole lot back from people who returned to work and were encouraged to work from home, start at 3 days. I'm not going to get into a maternity speech here, but phase yourself back in, work the way you want to work. And I always felt, as a boss who was lucky enough to have several people who'd got small children and been on maternity leave, I got more out of people in 3 days, quite often, than I'd get out of somebody in 5, because they were better at managing their time and more committed to balancing their work life. Mutual trust, powerful tool. Social time is important. We introduced something that was a bit daft, but just saying, if it's meant to be a social group, let's have a social time. So every Thursday we'd have, in the canteen, we'd open up the bar. Anyone wanted to come in London, we'd have a bit of laugh, we'd make some presentations, people would drink. I got in trouble, I think, the first year we did it, because it turns out some of the younger people decided to have a football match at 9 o'clock at night when everybody had left, and then a cricket match, and they were all thrown out by security at 1 in the morning. But we had to kind of tighten it up, but his idea was it's okay to have a laugh, have a drink. Communication with care. I mentioned earlier the massive email with the strategic plan to all the people who worked in the call centre. These kind of phrases hit me all the time. We email the 3-year plan to all employees and they don't understand it, not surprised. We held a roadshow to communicate the results, one-way communication, to a call centre. Our screensavers, whoa, how many of you have got this, are our vision and values. Fuck off is my answer. Nobody would say that. So on communications, have a clear plan. Conversations that focus on the big things. So think about who you're talking with when you're on a roadshow. Make it relevant to the audience, HQ versus call centre. So if we're in head office and we've got all the higher paid people usually sitting there doing strategic jobs and everything else, then you can talk about the plan in a way, because most of them have helped to write it. But if you're in a call centre, just all they need to know is 2 things really. We're doing okay, and we'll give them the headline numbers, and you're all doing well. And by the way, you're on track to get your 5% to pay bonus. That's about it in a call centre with 16,000 people. And then, by the way, would you like to ask any questions and tell us what's going on? Use the board, go back to the Allied Domecq days. You can't delegate that kind of leadership responsibility. So the people who run the company have to get out there and be seen. Recognise individuals, as we did on Thursdays. Accept feedback, act in closer circles. I'm going to tell you one last thing, I'm running slightly over. When I worked, I'm ashamed to say that in PepsiCo, when the restaurant business hadn't been spun off as Yum brands, we had KFC, Pizza Hut and Taco Bell as our 3 main brands. And I was living in Hong Kong and was responsible with another guy for opening Kentucky Fried Chickens in China. Sorry, it took me a long time to eat chicken, I have to say. I hadn't eaten chicken since I was a kid, and when I joined that company I had to force myself. KFC in China is now, since the year 2000, is bigger than KFC USA. It's more than $1 billion worth of profits coming in. I mean, we went in there straight after Tiananmen Square, when the government actually sent you employees. So if you were opening a restaurant, 45 people would turn up with files under their arms and they'd be your employees. The rate of pay was $5 a week in 1990. That's the state amount of pay. The average restaurant that we opened, the first for Tiananmen Square, had 40 tills and in the end 300 employees, and was the biggest in year 1 in PepsiCo's world. So imagine big scale. Then when I was sitting out there, we were doing a communication. We'd opened 5 or 6 stores. We were still experimenting with the side. We had a feedback session. So we went over to Beijing. Sam Su, my marketing guy, was Chinese, so he did the Mandarin speaking. I didn't speak Mandarin. And he said to me, he turned to me, he said, well, I've asked them if they've got any questions, and he said, there's a rather interesting one. I said, what's that? They said, well, they're not very interested in the business, but could they have a shower? I said, what? So I did a little research, sat there, said, okay, explain. And it turns out that, obvious, in those days at least, probably not changed much, 90% of our employees came from kind of the equivalent in Chinese terms of tenement blocks, with a central shower and toilet facility that they went up and down flights of stairs to. They came to work on bicycles. It's hot and sweaty in the summer. They wanted to shower when they got there, and they wanted to shower before they left home. So we started building restaurants with showers, and the next one we built had 40 shower model cubicles out the back. And I thought, okay, reward from you know, my British Leyland days. What kind of benefits program can we introduce? Because the government set the pay at the time. We couldn't flex that. But benefits, that's okay, as long as they didn't have a cash value that you gave them that they could trade. So the benefit program for China became a litre of shampoo and a litre of shower gel for every employee every month. And we became, on the back of that, the employer of choice in China. Shampoo and shower gel. Think of that. It's different now. But all that happened was we listened, and that's what came out. Please can we take showers? That's it from me.